Hi everyone, it's Father Ryan, and we're continuing our series with this fourth video about the case for Jesus. And in this video, we're going to look at some external evidence of the Gospels being written by these four men named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What do people outside of the Gospels say about them? And for this, I have a couple accompanying charts right under this video. We're going to look at some early ancient witnesses to these Gospels. 5 different church fathers, as well as a canon, a list of the scriptures that we find in Rome in the early centuries. So these are early Christian writers, people who knew the apostles or who knew people who knew the apostles. So think of Holocaust survivors, people who knew someone who survived the Holocaust, who was there. That's how close these writers are to the events of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in the writing of the Gospels. And they come from all parts of the known world of the Roman Empire at the time. So they're spread out all over the place. And so what do they say about the Gospel of Matthew? You can read some of the quotes from the document I have attached here on this website about things that these early Christian writers say about the Gospel of Matthew. And they all agree that one of Jesus' disciples, this man named Matthew, who used to be a tax collector, who'd been with the Lord, is the author of the Gospel attributed to Matthew. They all believe that he was an eyewitness, he was an apostle, and that he's the one who wrote the book of Matthew. And they all agree that this gospel was written while Matthew was alive, while he was preaching. St. Irenaeus says it was written while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome, so sometimes before they were killed in the mid-60s. And they also say that it was written in Hebrew to provide Jewish Christians a gospel, a proclamation of Christ before Matthew had to leave and go preach elsewhere. And then that it was translated into Greek by someone who, maybe we don't know exactly who that is, but they all agree that it was written by Matthew. How about Mark's Gospel? Well, you can read different quotes of the early Christian witnesses about Mark's Gospel in this chart. And according to the earliest evidence, they all say that the author was Mark, the traveling companion and disciple and interpreter of the Apostle Peter, who was with Peter, who heard Peter's preaching in Rome, who traveled with him. And likely Peter was preaching maybe in Hebrew, and it says Mark was his interpreter. So it might mean he was translating things into Greek. Of course, he wrote the gospel then in Greek. And so this early Christian witness named Papias admits that Mark was not an eyewitness to Jesus, but he was a companion of Peter, and that he wrote his gospel based upon the teaching and preaching of Peter. So Mark's one concern, he says, was to accurately represent Peter's teaching, to faithfully write down what Peter said and what Peter said Jesus did and preached. And so there's slight disagreement about when it was written, but they all agree that it was written by Mark. What about Luke's Gospel? Well, again, you can read the quotes on the chart, and all the earliest writers agree that this Gospel was written by the man that's witnessed to in the letters of Paul, that he was a well-known physician, he was a follower of Paul, he went with Paul on some of his missionary journeys, and he wrote down the gospel as it was preached by the Apostle Paul. And so there's many things in his gospel that we don't find in Paul's letters, things that Paul was preaching about the life and the sufferings and the death of Jesus. And of course, Paul was preaching in Greek, so there was no need for Luke to translate. He simply gave an accurate account. He says in the prologue that he wants to give an accurate account of the things that transpired in an ordered way for us to understand the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So everyone agrees that Luke wrote the gospel for non-Jewish Christians, and it was written, Origen says that it was written third, after Mark and Luke, or after Matthew and Mark. And finally, how about John's gospel? Well, reading the quotes on the chart, we see unanimous agreement that it was written by the apostle John, who was with the Lord, an eyewitness, an apostle of Jesus. Some people recently want to claim that it was written by a different John, John the Elder, who is said to be the writer of 2nd and 3rd Peter, or 2nd and 3rd John. But it's unanimous agreement among the early church fathers that the gospel was written by an eyewitness, by the apostle John, not the other John, not the elder John. And so they say it was written to supplement the information that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and to specifically defend the divinity of Jesus against early Christian heretics who denied that Jesus was God. So that's what the early church fathers tell us. Irenaeus even says that the early heretics and enemies of the church accepted the four Gospels as written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and would use maybe one gospel or a portion of their gospel to defend their own doctrines. Of course, we take all four gospels as, the revelation of divine truth to us. So what we find is that all the external evidence universally and unanimously say that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's no hint of these gospels ever being just anonymous. And so what about the other gospels, that didn't make it into the New Testament, the so-called lost gospels? We'll look at them in our next video.